The Italian in New York. This picture shows a family coming from Italy that they are pointed out as different. Darker skin, normally darker hair, like brunettes, with brown eyes. This is typical, stereotypical Italian, but you can see that there's a little boy noticing at such a young age that there is a difference between his color and his mother's color. This picture represents a family coming off the boat, and you see that their clothing is not fancy and queen style. You can see that they're in a lower class, and that meant it was going to be even harder for them to survive and get around and maybe have to live in the streets until they were capable of controlling their financial situations. Like I said before, you can notice that the hair color is darker. Most Italians have brown hair, maybe black, with dark brown eyes, and like I said before also, the skin color is more noticeable. That's why in the picture previous to this, the little boy was pointing. This picture represents the home of an Italian ragpicker. Back then, women and men had jobs, but when you immigrated to New York and you're Italian, it was harder to get jobs. Remember, you're still not speaking fluent English, or the language everyone else there spoke, so it was harder for them to get jobs. Men sometimes were tenants, and women sometimes were ragpickers. This picture represents people from Italy that were immigrating to New York that at first didn't have jobs because, remember, most people didn't know English back then that fast, and they didn't have the types of resources that we have nowadays, and they were stuck trying to learn on their own, so they wound up sleeping sometimes outside. Sometimes families were forced to deal with whatever Mother Nature threw at them, especially because they were coming from somewhere completely different, a whole other country. They were stuck with having to deal with the consequence of not having a job and not knowing the language yet. It was very hard for them, and being outside with their families was even worse because kids were so not immune to any bacteria that could have been caused illness. This picture was to get you to have a feel of what the clothing was like and what the markets looked like. When you weren't rich and wealthy, especially being a new immigrant, you didn't have the money to go shopping somewhere very extravagant. You shopped in the lower markets across on the street corners, by the new deli, or by the theater. This picture represents a family that had kind of a rough growing up in America, if you want to call it that, because they didn't have the money to buy themselves a nice house, lived in an apartment they could afford. Especially coming from somewhere else and not having a lot of money, they had to afford cheap clothing and cheap dishes, tablecloths, and shared rooms. Like the image before you saw, this one also shows that the family was unwealthy and that a family had a lot of struggles growing up, especially if you had a lot of kids in the house, and immigrating to a new world was harder because, like I stated, there was a lot of problems with language, not knowing the common language everyone spoke, and learning it took time. Growing up in a rural area and a new area that you do not know or understand anyone, seeing signs say murder for money, if you can read them or understand what they say, was very scary. So walking around the corners of these dangerous streets and roads, you had to worry about your kids' safety and your safety. This also shows that, like I said, the houses weren't always the nicest, neither were the hidden roads and the streets. Things were dangerous being there, and you didn't know which alley you were walking down if you couldn't read the sign. So for them, it was a lot more scary than anyone thought. This picture was from the areas where Italians stay, the ones that had a little bit more money than the originals, I guess you could call them, or the people that didn't really have money. They stayed in nicer apartments, and they also had a lot better chance of survival being in nicer, cleaner areas. Unlike the Ritchie areas from where Italians would immigrate to in New York, this area in the picture is an area where people that could not afford the really, really nice apartments or buildings to stay in, this is where they stayed, the ones that needed jobs more than others. And they needed a lot more supplies and utilities, sometimes because they had bigger families. This picture also shows that people that were very unwealthy, they had it rough. They had really bad houses sometimes. Sometimes there was a lot of disease, and for families to live there, as good of an idea as their parents had thought, turned out sometimes bad because of the houses they lived in were very dangerous and unsafe for the family and for them and their health. This image represents people that were selling jewelry and CrossFit where Italians didn't realize whether or not it was a scam, and this is because it was on the side of streets. People that were wealthy, they went to places that were a little bit more reliable in their process, and you could really tell if it was a decent product or if it was not. Don't write yourself off there. It's only in your head. On a happier note, there were fun things to do when you moved there. They did have carnivals and festivals, and this picture shows you a bunch of people kind of just being there and having fun. This picture shows men at work. It shows them what they did as jobs. Not all men did this specifically, but this was just one type of job that some men did. Other men, for a living, they would do construction work, being on beams and rafters, so that was a dangerous job. On a happier note again, there were places and things for people to do when they had free time. There was theaters, there was arenas, there were a lot of fun games to do, and kids just were able to have fun. Sometimes it was a little unsafe, but Italians like to gamble and play cards, so they would do that on their Friday and Saturday nights. There was always a lot of fun things to do other than gambling. The one famous theater that was found was the Harry Hills Variety Theater in New York City. A lot of Italians were seen there. Also, it's established in 1854, which was when most people were starting to come over into that specific area.